As I've discussed in a previous video, in the realm of gaming news, there's not much that can sting worse than the cancellation. That feeling where a game you've been anticipating potentially for quite a while is suddenly just ripped away from you completely. After all, how are people supposed to live on knowing that they no longer exist within the same world where Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness 2 came out? But what if years after the fact, through some seeming act of divine intervention, the game that was long thought to have been dead not only gets fully completed, but receives a wide release as an official product? Sounds too good to be true? Well, how about you join me as I show a handful of games that pulled off a real-life plot twist by turning out to have been alive the whole time after disappearing for decades. These are the cancelled games that got resurrected. Let's ease ourselves into things with probably the most well-known case of this happening, with the scrapped sequel to a Super Nintendo sci-fi classic, Star Fox 2. To catch the people unfamiliar with the spacefaring adventures of Fox McCloud up to speed, the original Star Fox, also known as Starwing in Europe, was the end result of a collaboration between Nintendo and British developer Argonaut Games, the title being inspired by one of Argonaut's previous releases in 1986's Star Glider for 8-bit computers, with its development also leading to the creation of the Super FX chip, a coprocessor featured within certain SNES games which, in addition to facilitating more advanced 2D effects, was capable of rendering 3D models, something which at that point in time was a rarity on home consoles. Upon its release in 1993, the original Star Fox would very quickly become a killer app for the system, garnering critical acclaim for its position as an early pioneer of 3D game technology, as well as the specific subgenre of 3D rail shooters, with the title managing to sell over 4 million copies, placing it as the 10th best-selling Super Nintendo game. And whilst it arguably hasn't aged as gracefully as some other big releases from the era, it's still often regarded as a SNES classic. Given that success, it was only natural that a sequel would be made to capitalize off of it, with Argonaut and Nintendo once again working together to make it happen. The game going from a linear rail shooter with 3 different routes to instead a more RTS-like game in which the player chooses 2 pilots, each of which have their own strengths and weaknesses, and is tasked with defeating Andros, whilst making sure to take out enemies and put up defenses to protect Corneria, along the way liberating planets under the control of Andros' forces and rival mercenary group Starwolf. In addition to battles against incoming enemies and missiles featuring a more free-roam style of flying, grounded missions which task you with liberating planets from Andros' forces allow the option to transform the R-Wing into a walker, better suited for ground control, both of which were achievable through the use of the more powerful Super FX2 chip, which was also used for games such as Yoshi's Island and the SNES port of Doom. In addition to being advertised in various magazines, a playable build of the game was shown off at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in January 1995, where it received glowing praise from outlets such as GamePro, Electronic Gaming Monthly, and Nintendo Power, building up a lot of anticipation for its planned release in August that year. But then out of nowhere, despite the game being around 95% completed, it was suddenly cancelled. The reason behind this decision mostly stemming from a mix of the high production costs of the Super FX2 chip, as well as the fact that, unlike the original Star Fox, which was a graphical marvel for the time, by 1995, 3D gaming on home consoles was becoming far more sophisticated, with 32-bit systems like the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation, meaning that while Star Fox 2 still looked impressive for a Super Nintendo game, when compared to competition like the near-arcade perfect home port of Ridge Racer, it led Nintendo to instead prioritize their own efforts of making a 3D-based console with the Nintendo 64, with Star Fox 2 getting scrapped in favor of a game game which would highlight the system's capabilities, which would end up being 1997's Star Fox 64 or Lilac Wars in Power Regions, an expanded remake of the original Star Fox which would end up being, without question, the most popular entry in the series, both in terms of critical reception, which was almost unanimously positive, and sales, with it selling 4 million copies and placing as the 9th best-selling N64 game. Whilst various ideas from Star Fox 2 would end up getting used in later entries, such as the all-range combat and Star Wolf in 64, the RTS gameplay style being revisited for 2006's Star Fox Command, and the transforming walkers getting implemented in 2016's Star Fox Zero, for the longest time it seemed like the closest people would be able to get to playing the game was through various incomplete builds that managed to leak online. Or at least that was the case until June 2017, when Nintendo revealed the SNES Classic Edition, a micro-console which, in addition to featuring 20 classics from across the system's library, would also include a bonus 21st game, which turned out to be a fully completed version of Star Fox 2, made available to play by beating the first level of the original game. When people finally got to experience the long-lost sequel, the general reaction was mostly positive, the game getting praise for its incredible scope and depth, especially when you consider the era and hardware it was made for, and whilst there were some complaints over its short length, lack of traditional rail shooting sections, and poor technical performance, even people who outright didn't like the game were still happy to see it finally release, which would later be made more widely available in 2019 when it was added as part of the lineup for the Nintendo Classics emulators included with Switch Online subscriptions, meaning that all that's left for Star Fox fans to complain about is for Nintendo to finally make a new entry that isn't just a remake or reimagining of 64. Moving from one of the biggest publishers in the industry to one of the bigger names in the indie scene, let's take a look at the early history of WayForward's Shantae series with the rocky development of Shantae Advance Risky Revolution. Now, work on a sequel to Shantae had started at the same time production on the first game was wrapping up, towards the start of the 2000s, the original being a Metroidvania for the Game Boy Color, which follows the titular half-genie Shantae trying to fulfill her role as Guardian by saving Sequinland from the evil lady pirate Risky Boots, with some of the ideas for gameplay features also getting tested with a tie-in game for the first Scorpion King movie, the main innovation for the title being experimentations with layering, eventually leading to the concept of using special gates which allow you to travel between the foreground and background, which was inspired by various Super Nintendo titles as well as Virtual Boy Wario Land, with the story seeing Shantae once again having to stop Risky after she begins reshaping Sequinland by rotating the island's foundational structure, the King's Pillar, using a machine called the Tremor Engine. WayForward would end up making a demo build in order to showcase the game to potential publishers, consisting of the game's first world, which would also feature all the gameplay effects and mechanics they wanted to achieve. And it's here that the team would run into trouble, as by 2004, they were effectively forced into shelving the project due to them being unable to get a publisher on board, with the few that did show interest only being willing to do so if they stripped the game down so they could make it a much more smaller scale budget release, ultimately leading WayForward to turn them down due to not wanting to compromise the game's scope, as the smaller and cheaper GBA carts weren't even big enough to fit the demo build they had made, let alone the full game. The reason behind the lack of interest, as stated by Matt Bozon, a co-creator of the Shantae series and co-founder of WayForward, was due to the type of game they were making, a GBA title which would likely have a retail price of $40, just not being something the majority of publishers would take a risk on unless it either had already been proven to be a success in markets like Japan or have the backing of a TV or film license, with Shantae's prospects of making a profit already looking poor due to the fact that the first game, despite despite getting heavy critical acclaim, was a commercial failure. A fate often credited to the title being a Game Boy Color release in 2002, a whole year after the Game Boy Advance had already launched and effectively replaced it, along with them never really determining a core target audience they could sell or advertise the game to. Whilst there was a brief attempt of resurging the project in 2005 following the reveal of the Game Boy Micro, Risky Revolution would ultimately be shelved and abandoned. In fact, the same could be said for the Shantae series as a whole, which wouldn't receive a new entry for years until the release of Risky's Revenge, which launched as a DSiWare title in 2010 and reused various concepts and assets originally intended for Revolution. With this release being the first domino that led to Shantae gaining momentum in the indie market, leading to various ports of both the original game and Risky's Revenge, in addition to 3 more sequels with 2014's Pirate's Curse, 2016's Half Genie Hero, and 2019's Seven Sirens. During all this time, the idea of completing Risky Revolution was always in the back of the studio's mind. In fact, whilst it never released to the public, in 2013, WayForward would actually livestream a full playthrough of the pitch demo as part of the promotion for Half Genie Hero's Kickstarter campaign. And whilst for the longest time that seemed to be the closest people outside of WayForward would get to playing the game, in 2023 the studio would not only announce that they were going to finish the title as a digital release across all modern platforms, but through a deal with Limited Run Games, they'd also be making a small number of GBA cartridges for it, allowing the game to release on the platform it was originally designed for. And after a small delay, Risky Revolution would finally release in 2025, with it overall receiving a mixed to positive reaction, some genuinely liking the game, whilst others viewed it as more of a neat curiosity than anything else. Pretty remarkable how this series went from being considered virtually unmarketable to being popular enough to resurrect dead entries. And all it took was being able to weed out a niche audience in the age of digital releases, all whilst paying the bills by making a frankly ungodly amount of shovelware. Always remember to thank releases like Shrek Ogres and Dronkies and Smurfs 2 the video game for allowing Shantae to prosper. For our next story, how about we take a look at 2 games that were both initially cancelled and revived for the same reason, owing to their connections with Nintendo's biggest failure, with the long-forgotten titles Dragon Hopper and Zero Racers. Now, admittedly, we don't actually know much about either of these games' development history, as the vast majority of information we have on them come from either previews in magazines like Nintendo Power, or showcases at events like E3 and Space World. As far as for what we do know about them, Dragon Hopper was a top-down action game made by Intelligent Systems, which tasks you, as the young Dragon Prince Doran, to navigate through various multi-floor mazes with the end goal of saving your family from a corrupt Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Zero Racers was an F-Zero sequel, which would have you race through 3D tunnels, unlike the original's more standard racetracks, but otherwise was more or less the same thing, with both games having been scheduled for release in mid to late 1996. So, what was the death blow this time? Well, instead of issues related to the development of the actual games, the demise of both of these titles can instead be blamed on the hardware they were made for, since if you couldn't tell from the screenshots, both Dragon Hopper and Zero Racers were made for the Virtual Boy. For the quick version of the history lesson, the Virtual Boy was basically a 32-bit VR system Nintendo released in 1995, which was effectively rushed out the door so they could have something new out whilst the N64 was constantly getting delayed. And owing to its high price, poor marketing campaign, awkward design, and tendency for causing eye strain and headaches, mostly due to it being a VR headset that can only display red and black, it was both a critical failure, often being heralded as Nintendo's worst console, and a commercial failure, with it reportedly only selling 770,000 units. Because of the system's immense unpopularity, the Virtual Boy was discontinued after only 5 months in Japan and a year in America. It dying so quickly that not only did the system never launch in PAL regions, only 22 games were ever released for it, with any other title that was announced or in the works, such as Dragon Hopper or Zero Racers, getting cancelled due to its very abrupt death. For the next 30 years, Nintendo would effectively avoid touching anything Virtual Boy related, its only real acknowledgement being the system itself making small cameo appearances in some of their games. But all of that would change during the September 2025 Nintendo Direct, where amongst announcements like the second Dragon Quest VII Remake, Legends Z to A DLC, and Fire Emblem 15, Nintendo announced that the next system to be added as part of their Switch Online's Nintendo Classic service was the Virtual Boy, much to the confusion of basically everyone, with it also marking the first time its lineup would see official re-releases, where in addition to 15 games, or about 68% of the system's entire library, it was also announced that finished versions of both Dragon Hopper and Zero Racers would be coming to the app as well, allowing the collective 5 Virtual Boy fans out there to finally play 2 of the games previously only seen in magazine screenshots. At the time of recording, neither game has actually been added to the lineup yet, with the only estimation of a release date being some point in 2026, but I figured I'd discuss it anyway because even though most people can agree that the Virtual Boy as a system kinda blows, it's still neat that Nintendo are willing to showcase their history, even for the parts that most people wish they could forget. Plus, imagine all the other cool cancelled games we could potentially see in the future, such as Bound High, Nico-chan Battle, and Virtual League Baseball 2. Truly, there's nothing more exciting. To end things off today, we'll be looking at the game which, whilst not the biggest or flashiest title we've covered, does hold an interesting story that led to it releasing not just decades after it was cancelled, but also several years after the development studio behind it died, with the long-lost arcade title Clockwork Aquario. The story starts in 1992 with Westone, a Japanese developer who are mostly known for their work with Sega, primarily as the creators of the Wonder Boy or Monster World series, with Clockwork Aquario having been planned to be the studio's final arcade release before shifting to fully focus on home consoles, with the intention of pushing the Sega System 18, the arcade board used for games like Shadow Dancer, Alien Storm, and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, to its absolute limits. The initial idea for the game was to effectively make something similar to Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, but with a higher emphasis on co-op. The final design seen players take control of either Huck Londo, El Moon, or Gush, in an attempt to stop Dr. Hangyo's attempts to take over the world. The main controls being to either jump on or slap enemies to stun them, in order to then pick up and throw them at other enemies and bosses, with some of the ideas that were planned but ultimately cut, including each character having different methods of attack via either a gun, magic, or stretchy arms. The game at one point being 3-player, hence why there's 3 playable characters despite it only being 2-player, and an invincibility button which by building up a gauge would, as its name suggests, let you temporarily turn invincible. Whilst the team behind it were able to get a playable build done in 1993 in order to use it for various test runs to get feedback, unfortunately not only was the response from players overall pretty poor, but by this point in time, 2D platformers were losing their footing in arcades to fighting games, which were experiencing a major boom following the immense success of Capcom's Street Fighter 2, as well as the rise in 3D games, which funnily enough was being spearheaded by Sega with releases like Virtua Racing and Virtua Fighter, games that look rudimentary now, but were utterly mind-blowing back then. Because of these factors, confidence ended up being lost in the game's chances to perform well, with with Clockwork Aquario officially being cancelled in 1994. And as mentioned before, Westone would completely abandon arcades to focus on home consoles, their final release being a Neon Genesis Evangelion title in 2003, with the studio ultimately going defunct in 2014, their assets becoming the property of the LAT Corporation, who have since worked with Sega to facilitate the creation of both remakes and brand new entries in the Wonder Boy series. As for Clockwork Aquario, nothing was really done with the game outside of a fairly random soundtrack release in 2006, it remaining almost entirely forgotten until 2020, when the game would see a savior from an unexpected source. Germany. Specifically, German publishers Strictly Limited Games and Inin Games announced that they had been working together to get the rights from Sega and LAT in order to finally finish and release the title for a digital and limited physical release on PS4, PS5, and Nintendo Switch. They're even getting some help from former Westone staff due to the source code, which they had acquired from Japanese developer and publisher M2, being partially lost, with the cancelled final chapter in Westone's arcade history seeing release in 2021, which ended up earning the title the Guinness World Record for the longest amount of time between the start of development and release of a video game at 28 years and 81 days. As for the game itself, well, it ended up getting an overall mixed reaction in the end, generally receiving praise for its presentation, soundtrack, and co-op, though the actual gameplay, particularly the pick up and throw mechanics, proved to be divisive, with it also getting a good amount of flack for its incredibly short runtime, it being possible to beat the game in only half an hour if you know what you're doing. And whilst the version of the game for Xbox would be later announced and released in 2023, news on a PC version that was confirmed around the same time has gone completely silent. Though I don't think the title's actual quality was ever what was important to most people, and instead the idea of a dead game from a dead studio managing to get brought back to life almost 3 decades after work on it had first begun was always the more valuable prospect, acting as a beacon of hope and something to cherish as a proud accomplishment in game preservation. We'll end things here for now, but with this, I hope it's clear that whilst it can take decades, there will always be hope for a work to be saved and preserved for people to play for years to come, and finally give closure on long unanswered questions. And it's with this hope that perhaps one day, someone will come along and give to the people what they want. A way to play DJ Hero 3D and Gauntlet DS.